Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third session of the News Literacy Project's fall webinar series. This session is titled Understanding Bias, a Nuanced Approach to a Vital News Literacy Topic. This is the third of four sessions. We have a fourth next Friday, same time, teaching you and exploring the Checkology virtual classroom with some of our colleagues. So be sure to tune in for that if you aren't already registered or it's not on your calendar. I'm Peter Adams. I'm the SVP of Education at NLP, and I want to dive into this topic, and we'll pause at a couple points for questions. This is always a topic of high interest among teachers and among students and the general public when it comes to talking about news media literacy and talking about news coverage. I wanted to start just with a quick definition from NLP about what news media bias is. Just to kind of frame the discussion here, when assumptions or opinions favoring one side or one interpretation of an issue or an event skew news reporting in some way that's unfair or distorting. It sounds straightforward enough, but it gets pretty complex. What counts as skewed and according to whom? So people see these things very, very differently, which is one of the things that makes this topic so thorny, but also so vital. So some driving questions I wanted to introduce up top as well, thinking about what counts as news media bias and who gets to decide, what journalists and news organizations can do to try to minimize bias. So what do those processes and best practices look like, both in practice and then as an end result in coverage, and how can educators effectively teach the concept of news media bias? So what are some strategies for doing that? And some supporting questions I would add underneath of that, just to drill down with a little more specificity. What do people really mean when they say that coverage leans left or leans right, or is left of center or right of center? People are fond of saying that about entire news outlets, and they're fond of saying that about particular pieces of coverage. But what does it really mean, right? And what is the center, and who gets to decide? Is most bias overt and intentional? I think a lot of teens tend toward the perspective that bias is intentionally infused in news products, that editors go around and tell reporters to spin a piece this way or that way, when the vast majority of the time at standards-based high quality news outlets that are trying to minimize bias, these are perceived incidents, so they're highly debatable, and they're incidental. Then some other questions, is all bias partisan? We're going to explore some different kinds of bias, even though everyone likes to talk about partisan bias, particularly now. There are lots of different kinds of bias we could explore. And is journalistic objectivity a helpful concept? So these are some things to get on our radar here early on as we sort of dive in. So often I think when folks explore bias in the classroom, sometimes a piece of journalism comes up and it's presented to students in some way, whether it's run off and handed out or projected at the front of the room. And teachers might ask questions like, find the bias or analyze this piece for bias. And so if I were to do that with this piece, which is from yesterday, about the large group of Haitian migrants who are assembled in South Texas, sort of waiting at a migrant camp to be processed, I might analyze that picture and think, well, is there something off about that picture, something that the folks at the Washington Post wanted me to think or feel? The word thousands, is that loaded somewhere? Is that accurate? So these are some of the things that might go through my mind. Same thing if I look at this, right? So if I'm invited to think about bias, I might home in on the word surge here, particularly if I'm a progressive and I tend to scrutinize Fox coverage or think that Fox is biased. The word soar, right? Is that accurate, or is that spinning or skewing at all? So I might focus on those details if you ask me to. So I wanted to just share those examples, not because I think either of those has overt bias, but because if you put up a piece of coverage, almost any piece of coverage, and you ask students, where's the bias, analyze this for bias, or what does this media message want you to feel, they're going to invent and create bias. So they're going to actively read bias into news reports, much the same way that we tend to see patterns in random collections of information. We tend to see bias when we're asked to see it, if that's the assignment, both because our own biases get mixed up in our interpretation and experience of news, but because that's what we're asking them to do in the classroom if we organize an activity that way. So continuing along that same line of thought, let's think about a little about what just this headline. So I've stripped away the source of this for now. And I want you to just use the chat and see what your students might think, or just make notes to yourself how your students might process this headline about another big event, Biden's new vaccine mandate that he spoke about last week. And if we just analyze that headline and we ask students to look for bias, they might home in on the word sweeping, for example, right? Or the quote, "This is not about freedom." If I add the photo to this, students might similarly be invited to see that one way or the other, depending on their perception of coverage about Biden, about their feelings about Biden. They might see this as a neutral picture. They might see this as a photo that shows command and strength. They might say it's making him look confused, right? So they could be creatively sort of trying to satisfy the prompt, which is to analyze bias or find bias. And finally, if I reveal that this is from Fox, students' feelings about Fox and their own ideologies, the partisan dispositions of their families and their communities start to come into play. And students may, perceive bias in the word sweeping, for example, and pin that on Fox if they're critical of Fox. This is actually a piece from the Associated Press that Fox picked up, and as outlets sometimes do with wire pieces, tweaked the headline. So they've tweaked the story a bit, but this originally was an AP piece. AP used the word sweeping. And again, you can really get into some interesting discussions about whether that's accurate or that's skewing in some way, or inviting people to feel something that might mislead them about the topic. And if you compare the two headlines, you will notice that Fox added, "This is not about freedom." Now, some students might perceive bias there, but that's a perception that they would need to then go and test and investigate. So to look, who else covered that particular line? Did anyone else put it in a headline? So I want to look at 3 instructional methods to introduce bias that I think can help you get rolling in a really straightforward way that should be pretty easy to adapt in the classroom. One is just to try to introduce how complex these things get and how difficult our perceptions about bias are by just presenting headlines out of context from the same news cycle, and then some news organizations, and see if students can match it up. I think often people think that even just headlines differ so much from one outlet to the next, or one news organization to the next, that the bias is this simple question. You'll know it when you see it, and it's often very hard to perceive or impossible to perceive at just the headline level. You have to dive deeper. So in this instance, here are the right answers, right? Here's how these headlines align to the outlets that publish them. You could have one kind of critical conversation before you reveal the answers, and a different kind of critical conversation after, again, because our feelings about the New York Times or what we know about OAN, which is a hyperpartisan news outlet, would get mixed up in our interpretation of those headlines. This is going to be an interesting exercise, again, just to get the complexity of the topic out on the table. And you can move then from headlines and lead photos to things like lead sentences, lead paragraphs, to full coverage comparisons with students. So it can be a good sort of entry point or on-ramp to some of those conversations. You can also embrace students' differences of opinion as opportunities to explore the specifics. So if some students think something is particularly problematic, they perceive bias in a headline, and another student doesn't, or another group of students doesn't, you can facilitate a really rich conversation. Ask the students who perceive bias how it could have been different, how it could have been more fair and accurate. That's much more productive than just sort of taking perceptions at face value and moving on. And then finally, you can invite and involve local journalists in your classroom to discuss their approach to minimizing bias and maybe share some of these examples with them. So a second activity, sorry, I've been talking too much this week, is something I've just called debatable or overt. And I set up top, high quality news coverage where there are processes to minimize bias most incidents of perceived bias are highly debatable, right? Different people are going to see the same headline different ways. And that's often the case even at partisan news outlets when it comes to just headlines, right? So let's take a look at that OAN headline. That's actually very similar to the AP headline that Fox picked up. They use the word sweeping. And there's nothing in the headline specifically that would make this necessarily overt in my view. And again, this is just an exercise, right? So I might classify that as debatable. If someone sees bias there, I would say that's debatable. We could actually have a debate about that. And it's not overt, it's not clear cut. If I look at the lead paragraph, however, and I want to see if anyone sort of notices here what OAN has done. They did it in the caption to the photo as well. Anybody spot the problem here, or there is an example of overt bias here right in the beginning of the piece. And I wonder if anyone spots it. Even in the first paragraph, you don't have to read far. That's not what I was thinking. We could have conversations about targeting, but yes, yeah, exactly. Exactly, Mandy's got it. So OAN, pushed a lot of, amplified a lot of sort of, QAnon conspiratorial fragments. They amplified a lot of election misinformation. They actually don't refer to Biden as President Joe Biden or President Biden, just Joe Biden. And I think in some coverage, they still refer to Trump as President Trump. So that I think is one thing that you can really drill down on some of those differences when you go further into coverage. So headlines are not a stand-in for coverage. You can't evaluate a news source by one article. You can't evaluate one report by a headline or a photo. Here's another from the Daily Kos, openly progressive blog. This one mentions, takes on Republican governors. So that, I might say that's pretty overt, right? I would say that could be fairer and more accurate. That could be less biased. Here's another one. And if I don't disclose where this came from, we can just take a look at the headline, kind of let you privately form your opinions here, right? We could have a lot of critical conversations about the word force, for example, here, I think, but I still think that's debatable, right? It happens to be from the Daily Wire that does publish a lot of really overtly partisan stuff. But in this case, that particular headline, I think it's debatable. We could debate. This headline from the New York Times selects a different quote than the one Fox quoted. Our patience is wearing thin. Does that bias the piece at all? We could, I think, have a debate about that as well. Again, not equating the quality of journalism at the New York Times to the other three outlets that are on the page with it here, but just looking at the headline and thinking, if I just start by sorting into debatable and overt, what does that get me and where can that get me with students? There are really overt examples. The Federalist, for example, not only does it categorize this story as related to the quote Wuhan virus, which is offensive, but it uses the word, it starts the headline in fascist move Biden administration to force vaccine mandates on private companies. So that's very clearly loaded. So you can come up with some really overt examples, but you can work through the coverage and have these kinds of conversations about the headlines, especially if you select straight news pieces from the same news cycle, and just present them with students and have discussions about word choices, about quotes that are included in the headline, in this case, lead images, and then you can move deeper into coverage and move from there. So that can be one helpful thing to get started. RT, I should mention, by the way, is a Russian state news source and often has really inflammatory, divisive headlines like this one with the all caps mandatory, something to really warn students away from. So this debatable and overt exercise makes a few other things available to us, right? You can have students bring in examples and then discuss and sort into debatable or overt on a regular basis if it's something students recognize. Every Friday, if you have time to work it in that often, once a month, have a debatable or overt session where students collect coverage. You could ask them to collect coverage about a topic that you're discussing or a particular current event, or leave it up to them. And then once you've built up collections over time of debatable things and overt things, you can start to analyze those different collections for insights. What news organizations show up most often in the overt stack? What are some of the things that trip things over into overt as opposed to debatable? And how do we watch out for them? Things like that. You can also select a set number of examples and say, create a poll for friends and family. So students could say, here are 10 pieces or 5 pieces, and take that home and say, do you think this is debatable or overt, debatable or overt? And you could create even 2 groups of people, one of whom see the news outlet it came from and the other does not, and see if that impacts their judgment and draw some distinctions there. Especially if you're working with older students, you can get into some higher level things about people's perceptions of coverage. And again, students could also involve a local journalist. At NLP, we're very big on tapping into the expertise of local journalists and having them connect with students, and we try to facilitate those connections with our resources. And then finally, a third thing you can do is just to plot these things on a spectrum to really drive home the point that news media bias is not a matter, it's not a binary. Things are not unbiased or biased. They're more biased or less biased, right? I think everybody pretty much agrees that perfect objectivity is impossible for humans to achieve. And it's also impossible for us as biased humans to recognize something that would be perfectly objective anyway. But we can certainly see differences, right? There are certainly distinctions. So I think students sometimes fall in the trap, and adults as well, that because perfectly unbiased objective news is an impossibility for humans, it doesn't matter, or that we should stop talking about it, or that everything is as equally viable as anything else. If everything has bias, I can just there is no difference between news organizations or sources of information. I think you can draw that really sharply into focus and help them understand that there are very distinct differences in coverage. So this would be a way to arrange, particular coverage, again, from the same news cycle on a kind of x-axis from less biased to more biased, and you could generate a lot of interesting opportunities for inquiry there. You could also do that over time with sources, and students might move these around as their perceptions of sources change. You'll probably have to limit the number of sources on the table for them to keep it simple, but they could monitor coverage, or you could divide them into teams and have an AP team and a New York Times team, and they could come up with their understanding or their evaluation of coverage. Or you could have them comparing coverage from these outlets, and over time, develop a kind of perspective on the general orientation. But that takes time. That's more than you can determine with a single report. And of course, I know you're thinking it. That's very similar to the Ad Fontes media bias chart. And we always get asked about how helpful these can be. And so we have some thoughts. There's the Ad Fontes chart. This is their latest one. There's also media rankings like All Sides, which rate things into left, far left, leans left, center, leans right, far right. And these can be interesting, right? But they are, I think, good models for inquiry, but not really definitive ratings. So we shouldn't take these things as gospel, right? So Ad Fontes, for example, has NBC News as skewing left of CBS News, but I'm not sure that's true, right? I would have to really watch both of those newscasts and read their web and digital stuff to know. And so these placements and rankings are often highly debatable. That can be a good thing, right? If you can get students debating about where something belongs on the chart, or an Ad Fontes or an All Sides rating they think is off base, that shows a really deep level of engagement and a high level of understanding of the concepts. Another problem that tends to come up around these is they can imply a kind of false equivalence between really high quality standards-based news outlets and overtly partisan or problematic ones, particularly the All Sides chart here. So this take on this particular story, if you chose something from center, something from leans right, something from leans left, you might think, well, I'm getting a balanced media diet, but it tempts you to sort of equate the New York Times as a leans left outlet with Zero Hedge, which is a libertarian blog that publishes anonymous pieces with no byline and has very different standards than the New York Times, right? It doesn't rise to the level of quality of the New York Times. And so that's a potential pitfall. It could misguide folks, and people are looking for easy answers because this thing is, these things are complex. Just to underscore what the New York Times does, and I think other high quality outlets do this as well, but these are things that you could look for. I want to just take a quick look at this story from December of last year. This is the headline that they wound up with, but it's not the initial headline on the story. The first headline in the story was this: video assaults thrust a Black man and French police into spotlight. So French police beat a man and it was captured on video. And so the first headline sort of puts the man who was beaten and the police on equal footing, put them both in the spotlight, right? So, and note, this is not a knock at Norimitsu Onishi, the reporter. Reporters don't usually write headlines, it's an editor. And there's a great Twitter account that if you're not following, you should, which is at NYT_diff. It's called Editing the Gray Lady. And it's a bot that just tracks changes to headlines and abstracts in the New York Times. So as this headline changed, NYT diff is tracking it. So the first change they made was to say now video assault of Black man puts French police into spotlight. So now the police and not the victim of the beating are in the spotlight. And then they tweaked it again in the third headline, in the spotlight instead of into. That's sort of minor grammatical change. And then the final headline, Black man is beaten on camera, thrusting French police into spotlight. So that has a very different cadence to it than the first headline, right? But you can watch the New York Times in this process through this Twitter account, home in on the right, the fairest, most accurate thing to use in the headline, the fairest, most accurate language. And you could go through the same process with the abstract. They changed the abstract a few times again in pursuit of fairness and accuracy. So there are tweaks to that as well, which I'll let you review on your own when you get the slides. You can see exactly how they've changed it. But what's important here is that this process is evidence that the New York Times is striving to be both accurate and fair, right? They are actually making changes, and you'll see this at other high quality outlets. And that's a demonstration that, you know, they have a concern for the truth. They care about being fair, and they care about being accurate. So they're demonstrating that over time. That doesn't mean the first headline was excusable, that it was a good headline, but it does mean that they have a process in place and that they have a concern for getting it right. That's not always the case, especially at some of the other outlets I showed you at the beginning. So that's an important difference to watch for, and it's meaningful. So some key points here from the top of our time together. Number one, conversations about news media bias mostly apply to straight news. So often people will take an opinion piece and say, look, it's so biased, but opinion pieces are supposed to demonstrate bias, right? They're supposed to have a point of view and express an opinion. In some cases, people talk about, you know, bias at an entire opinion department at a news outlet, or, you know, really problematic statements within an opinion piece. But for the most part, news media bias conversations are talking about straight news where there's an aspiration to not be biased, right? To be as fair and accurate as possible. Two, our perceptions of news, remember, are highly subjective. It's very easy to make snap judgments about all coverage from an outlet based on a piece of a report we hear when we get in the car or something we happen to see online without really looking at what other coverage they've done. Third, at high quality outlets where there is an aspiration to minimize bias, incidents of bias are usually incidental and debatable rather than intentional or overt, right? So there is much more nuance here and much more subjectivity in our evaluation of it than I think a lot of people tend to think, especially at first when they first get into sort of looking at these topics. And it's really important that students don't think that every news outlet has some sort of secret agenda to manipulate them in some way. That's a kind of you know, cynical nihilism that can be dangerous, right? And turn them off to some of the most credible sources of information. Doesn't mean they're perfect, but it means they have a concern for the truth. And that's worth engaging with. And then four, as I mentioned before, this notion that bias is a spectrum. You know, it may well be that perfectly unbiased news coverage is impossible for humans to produce, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. And then finally, evaluating bias in coverage in meaningful ways really requires us to be nuanced and specific, right? But we can embrace that nuance and specificity and complexity there. So I want to pause here just for initial questions. I'm not sure if anything was entered in the Q&A app. If you do have questions or comments, offer them in the chat. And we can take some of those here before we move on to some strategies for some additional strategies and resources for incorporating this in the classroom or addressing this in the classroom. Any questions from anyone here? I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A app. My question is if my voice is going to hold out for the remainder of the session. All right, if you do have questions as we proceed, please enter them in the Q&A app, but I'll move on for now, and then we'll tackle questions at the end as well. So please queue up your questions in the Q&A app, and don't hesitate to share thoughts in chat as well. So I'll offer a couple more supporting questions just to kind of organize our thoughts and approach here. One is, what forms does news media bias sometimes take? So people are fond of alleging bias, but when you ask them to drill down and say sort of in what ways is that biased and how does that bias show itself, it gets harder, right? And that's a good thing in this case. We want to complicate these concepts and perceptions for students, not to dismiss their life experiences or their perspective, but to deepen it and make it more substantive and empowering. And then second, what are common drivers of perceptions of bias? So what tends to get people's attention? So one thing that is common, that comes up in conversations about bias a lot, especially with police violence, is an amplification of official statements. So just uncritically amplifying what the police say happened, rather than frame it a different way, in a way that puts police claims on a more equal footing with claims of people who were on the scene or others, family members, or the victims of police violence. In this case, we saw lots of coverage of the shooting of Dante Wright outside of Minneapolis do this in headlines. Now, again, these are just single pieces of coverage, so I'm not sure it's fair to judge all coverage by the Washington Post of the shooting of Dante Wright and the killing of Dante Wright by just this headline. We would actually have to dive in and take a look at all of their coverage, and they published quite a bit about Dante Wright's killing, and so we could analyze that, right? But that is one sort of perception of bias that's common and often pretty substantive. News outlets sort of uncritically amplifying what police officials say in a way that sort of lends credence to their claims and more authority than maybe they deserve, given some of the things that have happened. Here's a piece by the AP that really highlights a direction that I think some news outlets are really trying to move toward, and to provide better coverage, more humanizing coverage of victims, to really underscore the loss, right? If you just focus on the police and you focus on the question of the taser versus was the cop going for her taser or not, you can kind of forget that there was a young man's life who was lost, and lose sight of who he was, right? And the gravity of that loss. And so this sort of pulls that into focus. So this isn't the only piece the AP did, obviously, about Dante Wright, but it is one, and it's one good example. Another common accusation is use of the passive voice can be really problematic. CNN caught some flack for this piece that said, two girls who assaulted an Uber Eats driver with a taser led to an accident in which he was fatally injured. So sort of removing the actions of the two girls in that case. They weren't alone in doing this. The NBC said that the man was killed in a crash. USA Today was much more direct and active, right? They assaulted a man with a taser and killed him, right? Killing him during an attempted car robbery. So these kinds of differences in language can become really interesting points of discussion, and a really great way to get students involved in analyzing these things, carefully, and refining their understanding and command of this concept. So a few more key points that I want to draw into focus here, and this 10 key points are also at the end of this slide deck in a little more detail. So there are some additional slides that you'll see when you open the deck yourselves that you can explore these a little further. So I'm just touching on them here to just kind of get them in play. But one, you've heard me say this a few times so far, but thinking about objectivity or journalistic objectivity in terms of an aspiration to be as fair and accurate as possible is much more useful. There are some robust debates about the term objectivity, whether it should still be used or not, whether journalistic objectivity actually refers to something different than objectivity in other contexts, how it's been practiced, the ways in which those practices have been flawed or not inclusive. And that's a rich debate. But for students, I think it's much more helpful to think about objectivity as an aspiration, or the aspiration to be objective in a journalist context, to be as fair and accurate as possible. It's really helpful to think about specific examples in coverage. Could this be fairer? Could it be more accurate? Also, being unbiased does not mean being neutral. This is a really key point. False balance or both sidesism can be a real problem in coverage when the preponderance of evidence about climate change, for example, indicates that it's not only happening, but it's happening as the result of human activity. And coverage that is neutral on that topic is actually biased in a different way, right? It's biased by being false, by introducing false balance in an attempt to be neutral rather than accurate. So again, that could this be more accurate? Could this be more fair? That helps us sort of get to that question of false balance in an interesting way, but that's a really important point. When evidence indicates something, do vaccines work? Coverage shouldn't be neutral on that question. I think news organizations have gotten a lot better on that in recent years. Also, teaching students to test their perceptions of bias, to doubt their own perceptions of bias and test them, right? To authenticate them, to say, look, that looks like it's off to me, but let me go see what the rest of their coverage is like. Or, that the Fox including this is not about freedom in that headline, maybe that's fishy, but maybe it's just my feelings about Fox. If I'm a progressive student or if I'm a conservative student, maybe my impulse is to defend Fox. Let's go test that perception in coverage elsewhere. Let me see if I can find that quoted in other headlines or in other subheads or abstracts, and just test that assumption. So that's a really important process for them to go through, and also then to fix the problem they find. So if they really do think that there's bias somewhere after they've sort of paused, analyzed it, questioned their own perceptions, then how would they fix it? How could this be fair and more accurate? Rewrite the headline. These are great activities to really help students, develop a command of this concept, but also empower them to talk back to coverage that they find problematic online. Also, helping students be wary of sweeping assumptions about intent or hyperbolic statements about the media, right? They're almost always unfair, and they really, really need specificity to be helpful. And then finally, a perception of bias, and we've touched on this, is really the beginning, not the end of inquiry. That's just a really key point in approaching that. So we developed a lesson also called Understanding Bias, like this session, on our Checkology virtual classroom. And we've introduced a taxonomy of types and forms. I don't know if anyone in the room has used this lesson. If you have, you might throw something in the chat. There's a link to it there if you'd like to preview it, or if you have an account, you can sign in and get to the whole thing. But breaking the news media bias down into types and forms can really help students sort of take a greater command of the concepts, and also recognize, think, and be more thoughtful about conversations about bias when they encounter them or things that they see online. We've talked a lot about partisan bias, and again, I mentioned up top, that's everybody's sort of knee-jerk type of bias to default to, but there are actually lots of other ways in which news can be biased. So once you get the initial concepts out on the table with students and start to have some nuanced conversations, you can introduce these 5 types. You can introduce the idea that there's demographic bias. We've touched on that a little bit earlier with some examples. There's also the potential for corporate bias, right? For the ownership of a news outlet to introduce bias into a story, intentionally or not. There's neutrality bias. We talked a little bit about that with false balance. So the impulse to be neutral rather than to be accurate. And then big story bias. So the desire to have a big scoop, to break a big story, can introduce bias and lapses in judgment. So to do this, because any given example could be debatable. We chose to use hypothetical scenarios in the lesson, and so based on this scenario, the task here, just to introduce these types, is to identify the type of bias. So let's try this together. You can use the chat if you'd like to provide an answer or your take. But this one's called lopsided experts. So in a year of covering advances in cancer research, a health reporter quotes dozens of doctors and other experts, but only 2 of them are women. So what type of bias is that? Kate says it's demographic bias. Anyone else playing along? Tanya says yes. Great. Yes, exactly. Exactly. So that is one example, right, of demographic bias. There are lots of different kinds of potential demographic bias, but that is one. Let's try another, more airtime. So the producer of a morning news show inadvertently dedicates more airtime to coverage of her preferred presidential candidate's platform than to the platforms of other candidates who are polling equally well. Yep, Jim's got it, partisan. That would be partisan bias, right? In this case, it's inadvertent, but they're polling equally well. They should have equal coverage of their platforms, right? It shouldn't skew. Senior editors at a local news outlet decide that allegations of corruption by their publication's parent company are not newsworthy enough to warrant extensive coverage or to be featured on the front page. So they decide instead to publish a short report in the business section. On the same day, a national news outlet puts this story on the front page of print editions and features it on their website's homepage. Yeah, that would be, and Valerie says, yikes, right. So these are, again, hypothetical, engineered to exemplify these 5 types that we're introducing, right? And yes, that would be yikes. Climate caution. So a social media manager at a national newspaper posts a story about a UN climate change report. And so the coverage isn't perceived as biased. She posts a graphic with the caption, "Is climate change man-made? Click here to find out." Yep, you guys got it. Jim, Kate, Heather, neutrality bias. So that's exactly what false balance or both sides journalism looks like, right? So the aspiration to be neutral instead of being accurate. And that would be an example of that. And then finally, a journalist who spends most of his time, you can't use process of elimination because I might double up on one, who spends most of his time in a metropolitan area, travels to a nearby rural community to report on an environmental hazard there, and in the report describes the community as, quote, a simple God-fearing slice of America. Correct, that's another instance of demographic bias. So I've left out big story bias here, but in the lesson, we have some examples of that as well. So once you sort of introduce types, the different types, we're not all the way home yet, right? So if you'll notice in these examples, this is demographic bias, but it showed itself in a different way than our first example of demographic bias. If you remember, the first example was someone who had sourced, to 10 of the 12 experts they sourced, they used as sources in their stories were men. In this example, it's the way a journalist is describing something. So that's quite different. They're both demographic bias, but they're taking different forms. So we also introduced a set of forms, and we just limited it to 5. This isn't meant to be comprehensive, but it is, the 5 major types and 5 major forms that can really help students sort of get rolling with these kinds of determinations. And again, spark a lot of really interesting conversations in your classroom. So those are tone, framing, the way a story is framed or approached, an absence of fairness and balance, story selection or news judgment. So what counts as news? So what gets covered and also what gets featured or promoted on the homepage or the front page, and then sourcing. So if we look at these again, in these scenarios, this is the more airtime scenario where a producer inadvertently dedicated more airtime to the preferred presidential candidate. What is the best form for us to choose here? So if it's coverage of the platform, but not the, they're not actually talking to, well, okay, so let me be clear. Yeah, I think it's an absence of fairness and balance in this case, Heather. To unfairly provide more coverage of one candidate than another is more a lack of balance than it is, the way something is framed. If a story was framed like the best candidate, let's take a look at, the leading candidate and they had a 1% lead, then that could be an issue of framing, right? So this is an absence of fairness and balance, I think, more so than other things. A journalist who spends most of his time in a metropolitan area and describes folks in a rural community as, quote, a simple God-fearing slice of America. This one is a little bit easier. We determine that this is demographic bias, but what form is it taking? Exactly. So tone, right? It's a patronizing, belittling tone. This is the outlet that decided that the corruption at their own publication's parent company didn't warrant extensive coverage or front page coverage, and they put it in a later section of the paper with a smaller story, but it made national news. That's story selection. Exactly. So remember, story selection isn't just what's covered and what's not, but how it's featured or how prominently it's featured. And then the story that was posted with the graphic, is climate change man-made? Click here to find out. We said that was an example of neutrality bias, but what form is that taking? Exactly, that's framing, right? So it's framed as an open question. It's framed as a who knows, right? When in fact we do know, and it's highly misleading. And finally, the reporter who cites dozens of doctors and other experts, but only 2 are women. That's an example of demographic bias taking the form of sourcing. So we really feel like this taxonomy makes a lot of interesting conversations available with students, gives them a way to actually apply what they know about bias to the coverage they see, and then can fuel more conversations. So if you start with some of those earlier approaches that we talked about, using default or overt or placing things on a spectrum, and you start to have those kinds of critical conversations, you can deepen those same conversations once you introduce the taxonomy and work with students that way. And you can have students do all kinds of things, like create their own scenarios and their own challenges once they learn these 5 types as well. So let's tackle a couple of questions here in the chat. Frederick's got one and says, as a librarian, I often have only one class to address these issues. What should be emphasized? So Frederick, in the chat, you mean one class to address bias, or one class, I hope not, to address news or media literacy altogether? If you're still with us. I'm going to assume you mean the concept of bias. If you only have one class or very limited amount of time as a librarian, I understand you don't have as much time. Okay. So if you only have one class to talk about bias, I would say, looking at some of those key points, the 10 key points, if you can convey the 2 or 3 that you really think you can instill, like getting students to understand that bias is typically incidental and debatable rather than intentional and overt. That's a point I think you have to make. Students express a really high degree of cynicism about all institutions. It's not just the news media. And it can be really disempowering in ways, right? So it opens them up to other sources online. It opens them up to dangerous rabbit holes online if they think that everything is out to manipulate them in some way. So I wouldn't miss that. And I would also, probably help draw into focus just how complex this gets and how much our own perceptions of bias are tied up in these conversations. So, sharing headlines, helping them understand, look, some of these things split the class. Some people see this kind of bias in this piece. Other people see opposing kinds of biases in the same headline or the same photo choice. That can maybe give them pause, right, and not make snap judgments that indulge their biases and maybe misrepresent the process or the news that they're looking at, and sharpen it. So if I had one class period, I might focus on that. Kate says, to what extent do photos exemplify bias versus headlines or word choice? I mean, that's tricky, right? Like headlines, photos there can only be one lead photo at the top of a piece typically, and there can be others further down. And there's only one headline. So the headline can't convey everything in the piece. Lots of things have to be left out of headlines. And no matter what one photo you include, especially if it's a complex event, it can be very hard to be representative. So representation is something that I think comes up a lot in photos, and in ways that, it's relevant in talking about language choices and headlines and things like that and framing devices. But I think thinking and talking about representation when it comes to bias is a little bit different and really important. the extent to which they exemplify bias versus headlines and word choice. I mean, photos are immediate, headlines and photos are immediate. And in our sort of news grazing culture, they have a big impact. So I think news outlets should be thinking more about those choices now than ever before. I also think they should be thinking about the social posts that accompany the links that they share, which is almost another kind of headline, right? Typically, the piece has a headline, but then when it gets pushed on social media, it gets more language in a post. And sometimes those posts are problematic in ways that the coverage itself is not. So I hope that answered your question, at least in part. And Mary says, how do you have these discussions with students who only get news from YouTube or Instagram? My students have no clue what the difference is between Fox and CNN, and they know nothing about the New York Times or the AP. And that's a really good question. I think you can start with some examples of things that maybe they're into. So if they're watching a YouTube personality who offers commentary about current events, or a podcaster or somebody on Instagram who makes those comments, to take a look at how fair and how accurate the statements of those pieces are, whatever they might be, and try to help them understand how that can be limiting, right? Or limit their understanding of something or shape their understanding in a way that might not be to their benefit, and it really disables them from getting the facts and making up their own mind about a given subject. And then when it comes to the differences between Fox and CNN, I think some of those activities, that was sort of my idea behind introducing just the headline at first in Debatable or Overt or in the matching game where you're trying to match an outlet. That can really be engaging for students who aren't as familiar with these things, and really aren't familiar to start with. And then once you really dive down and start finding overt examples and you have some good debates about how something could be fair or more accurate or whether it's biased in any way, I think hopefully they'll get more interested in those kinds of discussions. So I hope that that answered your question. So again, these 10 key points sort of anchor this conversation. And I do have later in the deck, and you can get a copy, I think Liz chatted that earlier, you can drill down on some more points about these 10. I'll leave you to do that on your own. We've got about 10 more minutes here. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to take them and continue to chat. I know it's a Friday afternoon, a Friday evening, so I'm not going to keep you unless there are more questions. Yeah, it's a great suggestion here from the team. Comparing news organizations, YouTube and Instagram accounts, and how those compare to other sources. That's a more immediate comparison. So YouTube to YouTube or Instagram to Instagram. I know, Kate, I don't know, it's been a long week. My voice is a little rough tonight. So if any other questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. I will hang out here for a few minutes, take a look at the chat, and encourage you to download the slides. And yeah, we can get the URL for the slides one more time, shared in the chat for all of you. Thank you, Gina.
Peter, don't forget the survey.
Oh, yeah. You know what? Can we just chat the survey? I forgot to put it on a slide. Thank you. Thanks, Liz. Sorry, I forgot that. So yes, if you could take a moment before you sign off, please don't leave yet. Click that link and just let us know how you found this session. We've issued similar surveys after each session. It just helps us understand what's working and what could be better. Take your suggestions and help us out there. So again, that bit.ly link is there. Liz just chatted it again. If everybody could click that, I think it's like just a handful of questions about how you found tonight's session and what was helpful for you. Thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy the weekend. Thank you for joining, and have a great night. I will again, I'll hang out if any late questions come in, but for everyone else headed out, have a great night. Thank you, Kate.